You have 30 days to pay the $10,000 compliance penalty and remove every single one of those trees, Mr. Turner, or the next letter you get will be from our attorney initiating foreclosure proceedings." The words hung in the oppressively humid afternoon air, thick and sticky like the scent of overheated asphalt in Karen's cloying floral perfume. She sat enthroned in her white golf cart, a modern-day Boudica of the cul-de-sac, her plus-size frame draped in a pastel pink tracksuit that strained at the seams. A clipboard, her scepter of suburban power, rested on her lap. Her face, a mask of smug satisfaction, was framed by a helmet of stiff, blonde-sprayed hair. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a declaration of war. The sheer audacity of it, the unblinking entitled confidence in her voice, hit me with the force of a physical blow. $10,000. Foreclosure. For planting trees. My trees. The very trees that shielded her and the rest of the neighborhood from the relentless prairie winds that had once made these backyards almost unusable. A dry, humorless laugh almost escaped my lips. It was the kind of absurdity you'd hear about in a barracks late at night, a story so ridiculous it had to be true. But this wasn't a story. This was my home. This was my property. And this woman, this self-appointed queen of beige siding and uniform lawn height, was threatening to take it all away. I felt the old familiar calm settle over me, the one that always came in the moments just before the chaos, the one that had kept me alive in places far more dangerous than this manicured slice of suburban purgatory. My heart rate slowed, my focus narrowed. I looked past her, at the line of trees in question. They weren't just a random collection of saplings. They were a multi-row mixed-species windbreak, a living wall of eastern red, cedar, bur oak, and hackberry that I had planned, purchased, and planted with my own 2 hands 5 years ago. They stood tall and proud along the western edge of my property, a dark green line of defiance against the endless, flat expanse of farmland that stretched to the horizon. They were my work, my investment, my contribution not just to my own property value, but to the livability of this entire edge of the development. And she wanted them gone. This is insane, right? I mean, who does this? Before you answer, do me a solid. Hit that subscribe button because you're not going to want to miss how this plays out. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare. I have a feeling I'm not alone in this. Now back to the battlefield. I let the silence stretch, watching the sweat bead on Karen's upper lip. She expected me to yell, to argue, to crumble. That's what people like her fed on, emotional reactions. I gave her nothing. I simply held her gaze, my expression unreadable. "Foreclosure, Karen?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Are you sure that's the word you want to use? Because that's a very specific, very legal process. You start throwing words like that around, you better have your paperwork in perfect order." A flicker of uncertainty, just a tiny crack in the mask of arrogance, crossed her face before she papered it over with more bluster. "The board has voted. It's final," she snapped, gesturing with a dismissive wave at the official-looking letter in her hand. "This is a formal notice of violation and intent to lien. The fines started accruing last month. $100 a day. You should have read your mail." She wasn't just the president. She was the judge, jury, and now apparently the executioner. The golf cart whined as she jammed the accelerator, kicking up a spray of gravel as she peeled away, leaving me standing in my driveway, holding a piece of paper that represented a profound and personal insult. I looked down at the letter. It was all there, in stark, bureaucratic black and white. The fines, the threats, the demand for the complete destruction of 5 years of hard work. I folded the paper once, twice, the creases sharp and precise, and slid it into my back pocket. The fight was on. She had just made the critical mistake of underestimating her opponent. She saw a quiet homeowner. She had no idea she had just declared war on a man who spent 20 years with the Army Corps of Engineers, a man who understood topography, regulations, and long-term strategic planning better than she understood her own HOA bylaws. This wasn't going to be a battle of lawn ornaments and paint swatches. This was going to be a war of attrition, fought with paperwork, procedure, and the slow, grinding machinery of the law. and I was going to enjoy every minute of it. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees she so despised. It was a strong, steady gust from the west, the kind that used to scour my back patio and send lawn furniture tumbling. But as it hit the windbreak, it softened, transforming into a gentle, swirling breeze by the time it reached me. The trees were doing their job. Now it was time for me to do mine. I walked back inside, the screen door slapping shut behind me, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet of the house. My wife, Sarah, was in the kitchen, a worried line creasing her brow. She had seen the golf cart, of course. Karen's arrivals were neighborhood events, usually signaling misery for someone. "Mark, what did she want?" Sarah asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She already knew it was bad. The only question was the particular flavor of bad. I pulled the folded letter from my pocket and smoothed it out on the cool granite of the countertop. I didn't say a word, just slid it over to her. I watched her face as she read it, saw her eyes widen, saw the color drain from her cheeks. She looked up at me, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Foreclosure? She can't be serious. Over the trees? The trees that stop my potted herbs from blowing into the next county?" Her voice was a tight whisper of outrage. "She's serious," I confirmed, my tone flat and calm. "She's also seriously mistaken." I opened the pantry and pulled out the thick, 3-ring binder, simply labeled House. Every document related to our property was in there, from the initial purchase agreement to the warranty for the dishwasher. I flipped to the tab marked HOA. There they were, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the document that was supposed to be the governing law of our little slice of heaven. I remembered reading this thing cover to cover before we even made an offer. I don't sign anything I don't understand. The developer, a fly-by-night outfit that had sold out and vanished a year after the last lot was sold, had slapped this community together on a former soybean field. The location was the big draw, right at the edge of town, offering what the brochures called country living with city convenience. What they didn't mention was the wind. The first year we lived here, before the trees went in, was brutal. This part of the country is a transition zone between rolling hills and open prairie, and the wind funnels across the flatlands with nothing to stop it. It wasn't just a breeze, it was a physical presence. It howled. It scoured the topsoil from new lawns. It made sitting on the back deck an exercise in futility. I saw the problem from an engineer's perspective. It was a design flaw in the development's siting. The developer had clear-cut everything to maximize lots, leaving the first few rows of houses completely exposed. After losing our third patio umbrella in as many months and watching our neighbor's trampoline attempt a cross-county migration, I decided to solve the problem. I didn't just go to a big box store and buy a few arborvitae. I went to the county's Soil and Water Conservation District office. I spoke with an agronomist. I got blueprints and species recommendations for establishing a formal windbreak, the kind farmers have used for centuries to protect their fields and homesteads. It had to be specific. Multiple rows, with the tallest, most resilient trees in the center and shorter, denser shrubs on the outside to create a permeable barrier that lifts the wind up and over rather than just blocking it. It was a science. I bought the saplings from a specialty nursery that cultivated native species. I spent 2 solid weekends digging, planting, and mulching, following the plan to the letter. That was 5 years ago. The HOA was barely a functioning entity then, still under developer control, and the Architectural Review Committee was a joke. I submitted a simple landscaping plan, a 1-page drawing showing a privacy screen of native trees. It was approved with a rubber stamp. Now those saplings were 20-foot-tall soldiers, and Karen, who had moved in 2 years ago and immediately staged a coup to take over the HOA, had decided they violated some nebulous aesthetic standard she carried in her head. I found the section on landscaping. It was vague, as these things often are, written by lawyers to be both all-encompassing and unenforceable. It spoke of harmonious and attractive environments and prohibited anything that would be an eyesore. It gave the Architectural Review Committee, which Karen now chaired, sole discretion to interpret these terms. It was a license to print violations. "There's nothing in here," I said, tapping the page. "Nothing specific about height, species, or location of trees beyond the standard utility easements." So she's just making it up? Sarah asked, her anger turning to confusion. Worse, I said, closing the binder. She's weaponizing ambiguity. She thinks because the rule is vague, her interpretation is law. She's counting on us to get scared, to see the lawyer fees and the fines, and just comply. I walked over to my desk in the corner of the living room and powered on my laptop. She's about to find out how an engineer deals with a poorly defined problem. I'm going to define it for her. The first step was simple. Document everything. I created a new folder on my desktop. Operation Defoliation. I scanned Karen's letter. I took high-resolution photos of the tree line from every conceivable angle. I took photos of my neighbor's empty patio, the one he never used because of the wind before my trees grew in. I dug up my original, approved landscaping plan from the binder and scanned it. I found the canceled checks and receipts for the trees and planting supplies. This wasn't just a yard project anymore. It was a capital improvement. I started a log entering the date, time, and content of my interaction with Karen. From now on, everything would be in writing. My first move wouldn't be to argue or yell. It would be to request, formally and politely, the specific covenant violation, the minutes of the board meeting where the vote was taken, and the established fine schedule that justified a $100 a day penalty. I was going to bury her in her own process. She wanted to play by the rules? Fine. We were going to read every single word in the book together. The email I drafted was a masterpiece of polite, bureaucratic warfare. It was addressed to the entire HOA board, not just Karen, and IBCC'd my own personal email address to create a time-stamped third-party record. I was courteous, professional, and utterly relentless. I referenced her letter, quoting the date and the alleged violations. Then came the requests. Pursuant to the HOA bylaws, Article 5, Section 2, regarding member access to records, I wrote, I formally request copies of the following documents within the 10 business days stipulated by state law. The list was long. The minutes of the board meeting where my property was discussed and the fine was levied. The specific written rule or covenant I was in violation of, with the exact wording highlighted. A complete record of all other violation notices issued for similar offenses in the past 2 years to establish a pattern of enforcement. The credentials and qualifications of the Architectural Review Committee members who made the aesthetic judgment. The official, board-approved fine schedule that authorized a penalty of $100 per day. I knew from my initial reading of the covenants that most of this didn't exist. The fine schedule was likely something Karen had invented. The vote was probably just her telling the other 2 board members, a retired accountant named Stan and a timid woman named Brenda, who seemed terrified of her own shadow, what they were going to do. By asking for the documentation, I wasn't just gathering intelligence. I was forcing them to either admit they didn't have it, or more likely, to fabricate it after the fact, which was an entirely different level of legal trouble. I hit send and felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The ball was in her court. For 10 days I heard nothing. The silence itself was a violation of the very rules she claimed to hold so dear. On the 11th business day, I sent a follow-up email, this time CCing my work email address as well. Gentle reminder, it began, of my formal request for records dated date, to which a response is now legally overdue. The next afternoon, an envelope was tucked into my front door. It wasn't mailed, it was hand-delivered, a classic Karen move to avoid postage and a postmark. Inside was not the information I requested, but a single sheet of paper. It was another letter from the HOA on their official-looking letterhead. It was a masterpiece of condescending, circular logic. Dear Mr. Turner, it read, the board is in receipt of your electronic communication. Please be advised that all decisions of the Architectural Review Committee are final. The violation is self-evident. Your property is not in harmony with the community aesthetic. The fines continue to accrue. Your request for extensive and burdensome documentation is seen as an attempt to harass the volunteer board members and will not be entertained. Continued correspondence of this nature will be referred to our attorney. It was signed by Karen as president and Stan and Brenda as board members at large. She hadn't just ignored my request, she doubled down, twisting my attempt at due process into an act of harassment. It was brilliant, in a twisted, despotic sort of way. But she had made another mistake. She put it in writing. Her refusal to provide the documents was, in itself, a violation of state law governing homeowners associations. I scanned the new letter and saved it to the evidence subfolder. It was time for phase 2. I knew I couldn't be the only one. People like Karen don't just have one target. They have a list. I started taking walks around the neighborhood in the evenings, not with headphones in, but just walking, observing. I saw the little signs of Karen's reign of terror. A fresh patch of sod where a beloved rose bush used to be. A faint outline on a garage where a basketball hoop once hung. A house that had been a cheerful yellow now painted the same monotonous HOA beige as its neighbors. I saw Mr. Henderson, a sweet old man who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, hurriedly tucking a small ceramic garden gnome into his garage as Karen's golf cart made its rounds. I waited until the coast was clear and ambled over. "George," I said, "how's it going?" He looked flustered, like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "Oh, hello, Mark. Just tidying up." "That looked like a tactical retreat," I said with a small smile. He sighed, the fight going out of him. "It's the gnomes. Karen says they're non-compliant yard ornamentation. I got a letter last week. $50 a day for everyday Norman here is visible from the street." He gestured at the little ceramic fellow in his hands. "My grandkids gave him to me." The sheer pettiness of it was breathtaking. "She's fining you for a garden gnome?" "And his friends," George said glumly, gesturing into the garage where I could see a half-dozen other little pointed red hats peeking out from behind a lawnmower. "She calls them a whimsical infestation." The phrase was so perfectly Karen that I almost laughed. "George," I said, my voice lowering, "she's trying to fine me $10,000 and force me to tear down my windbreak." His eyes went wide. "The trees, but they're wonderful. My wife and I can actually sit on our porch now without our newspaper blowing away." "Exactly," I said. "She's out of control. I'm fighting her. But I can't do it alone. I'm gathering documentation. Would you be willing to share a copy of the letter she sent you about Norman?" A spark of defiance lit up in George's eyes. It was the first time I'd seen it. "Son," he said, "I'll do you one better. I've got a whole file. Every nasty little note she sent for the last year. Come on in. My wife just made iced tea." It was the beginning of an avalanche. George's file was a treasure trove of petty tyranny, fines for leaving a garbage can out for 2 hours past the designated time, warnings about holiday decorations being excessive, a demand that he power wash a single, barely visible oil spot on his driveway. As we talked, I realized Karen's power wasn't in the rules themselves, but in the shame and isolation she created. She made each homeowner feel like they were the only one, the problem child, the nail that needed to be hammered down. By connecting with George, I had broken that isolation. The next day, I drove to the county courthouse. Not the local records annex, but the main courthouse downtown. It was time to stop looking at the neighborhood's rules and start looking at the bigger picture. The county records office was a cold, quiet place that smelled of old paper and floor wax. It was a library of deeds, plats, and legal filings, a place where the history of every parcel of land was written down in dense, legalistic script. This was my element. In the core, I'd spent countless hours in similar archives, tracing property lines for military bases, researching easements for federal projects, and untangling decades of bureaucratic red tape. To me, this wasn't a chore, it was a hunt. I started with the basics, the original plat map for the Whispering Winds Estates, a name so ironically pastoral it had to have been conceived in a marketing meeting. I found our development easily, a neat grid of lots carved out of a much larger tract of land. I spent an hour tracing the developer's history, how they had acquired the farmland, gotten it rezoned for residential use, and filed the initial covenants. It was all standard cookie-cutter stuff, but then I started pulling the files for the HOA itself. I wanted to see the minutes from every meeting, the annual budget reports, the record of liens filed. Most HOAs file these things with the county to give them legal weight. The clerk, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and a name tag that read Gloria, seemed to take a quiet interest in my project. After my third trip to her counter to request another heavy binder, she leaned in conspiratorially. "Fighting the HOA, huh?" she whispered. "I live in one. It's a racket. You have no idea, I said, giving her a tired smile. Let me know if you need the foreclosure filings for this subdivision for the last 5 years, she offered. Makes for interesting reading. I thanked her and made a mental note. That was a good idea. I sat at a long wooden table, the binders spread out around me like a command post. I started with the most recent meeting minutes and worked my way backward. The picture that emerged was grimly fascinating. Karen had been elected president 2 years ago in a low turnout election where she ran unopposed. The minutes from her first meeting were telling. Her first order of business was to propose an amendment to the bylaws to give the president the authority to levy compliance fines without a full board hearing for clear and unambiguous violations, a measure she claimed would streamline governance. The motion passed with Stan and Brenda, newly elected with her on a community standards slate, voting yes. It was a classic power grab disguised as efficiency. From that point on, the minutes became less detailed. Where they once listed specific discussions and vote counts, they now contained vague phrases like, the board discussed several ongoing compliance issues, and the board approved the recommended enforcement actions. It was a deliberate effort to obscure the process, to concentrate power in Karen's hands while giving the other two board members plausible deniability. Then I found the budgets. The HOA's income was modest, derived from the quarterly dues, but in the last 2 years, a new line item had appeared, compliance adjudication revenue. It had grown from a few $100s to tens of thousands. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was running a for-profit shakedown racket. The fines weren't a deterrent, they were a revenue stream. This was bigger than my trees or George's gnomes. This was systematic financial abuse. I took pictures of every single page with my phone, creating a digital archive of her reign. While I was waiting for one last binder, I took Gloria up on her offer and asked for the foreclosure filings. There were 3 in the last 2 years from our subdivision, all filed by the HOA's law firm. All 3 were against properties that had been sold shortly after the foreclosure was initiated. I cross-referenced the names. One was an elderly couple who had been moved into assisted living by their children. Another was a young military family that had received PCS orders to move overseas. The third was a man who had lost his job. These were not defiant homeowners. These were vulnerable people who were unable or unwilling to fight. Karen hadn't just fined them. She had waited until they were at their weakest and then used the full, terrifying power of the HOA's legal machine to take their homes. A cold fury settled in my stomach. This was no longer about property values or aesthetics. This was about pure, predatory greed. My phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Mark Turner?" a man's voice asked. It was clear, professional. "This is David Chen from the State Agricultural Extension Service. I'm returning your call about a residential windbreak." The final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. "Mr. Chen," I said, stepping out into the quiet hallway of the courthouse, "thank you for calling me back. I think I have a situation you'll find very interesting." I spent the next 20 minutes laying out the entire story, from the history of the wind to the specifics of the trees I planted to Karen's threats. I emailed him the photos in the original planting plan while we were still on the phone. He was silent for a long moment after I finished. "Mr. Turner," he said finally, his voice now carrying a note of genuine excitement, "you're not going to believe this, but you may have inadvertently stumbled into a pilot program. The state has been looking for ways to encourage suburban and exurban landowners to implement conservation-friendly landscaping. Things like pollinator gardens, rain gardens, and yes, windbreaks." He explained that a little-known and rarely used state statute, originally written for large farms, provided certain legal protections for agricultural features that served a significant conservation purpose, like preventing soil erosion. "The thing is," he continued, "the language is broad. It doesn't say the property has to be zoned agricultural. It just says the feature has to meet certain criteria. Your multi-row design, your use of native species, you've basically followed the USDA's best practices to a T. I think we can make a very strong case that your tree line is a functionally significant windbreak under the meaning of the statute." A slow smile spread across my face. "And what would that mean, exactly?" "It would mean," he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice, that it becomes a protected agricultural feature. It would be illegal for your HOA or anyone else to force you to remove it without a permit from my office. And I can tell you right now, we would never, ever issue that permit. The call with David Chen was a turning point. It shifted my mindset from defense to a full-scale counteroffensive. I now had a potential trump card, a legal shield forged from the unlikely combination of agricultural science and obscure state law. But a potential shield wasn't enough. I needed it to be certified, official, and undeniable. David agreed to schedule an on-site inspection for the following week. Just to make it official, he'd said, get the paperwork started, but from what you've shown me, it's a slam dunk. After hanging up, I felt a surge of adrenaline. The pieces were all there, spread out across the digital landscape of my laptop. Karen's escalating threats, her procedural violations, the financial data I'd unearthed at the courthouse, and now a powerful state-level ally. But data and allies are useless without a sound legal strategy. It was time to call in the professionals. I didn't want the HOA's lawyer, some guy who probably specialized in boilerplate collection letters. I needed someone who understood a fight, someone who saw this not as a nuisance case, but as a battle for fundamental rights. Through a veterans network I belonged to, I got a name, Jessica Riley. The description I was given was simple. She's a bulldog, hates bullies. She was a Marine Corps JAG veteran who had started her own small practice focusing on civil litigation and, as her website put it, advocating for the underdog. Her office was in a modest, renovated warehouse building downtown, a far cry from the glass and chrome towers where the HOA's lawyers likely resided. Jessica was sharp, energetic, and had an almost palpable disdain for petty tyrants. She listened intently as I laid out the entire saga, spreading my printed-out documents across her conference table like battle plans. I gave her the timeline, the letters, the photos, the financial records from the county, and the story of my conversation with the agricultural extension. She didn't interrupt once. She just nodded, her eyes scanning the documents, absorbing the information. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted a wounded, slow-moving target. "Oh, this is beautiful," she said, her voice a low purr of professional appreciation. "This isn't just an HOA dispute, Mark. This is a case study in fiduciary malfeasance, targeted harassment, and quite possibly racketeering." She picked up the first letter from Karen, the one with the $10,000 fine. "She put this in writing? The fine, the threat of foreclosure, all before a formal hearing or even providing you with the specific rule you violated?" "Yes," I confirmed. "She hand-delivered it." "Incredible," Jessica breathed, shaking her head in wonder. The sheer, unadulterated hubris. She's so used to people rolling over that she's forgotten the rules apply to her too. She's violated at least 4 different sections of the state's Common Interest Development Act right here in this one letter. She stood up and began to pace, energized. "Okay, here's the plan. We play dumb. We let her continue to think she's in charge. We let her walk deeper into this legal minefield she's laid for herself. The inspection with the ag extension is key. We need that certification. Once that's in hand, she has no legal basis for the fines, period. But we don't tell her that yet." "What do we do in the meantime?" I asked. "We formalize the resistance," she said. "You mentioned the man with the gnomes, George, and others. We need to get them organized. We need sworn affidavits from every single person Karen has targeted. We need to document every threat, every improper fine, every act of intimidation. We're not just fighting your case anymore. We're building a class action level portfolio of evidence against her and the entire board." She paused, pointing a finger at me. "Your job is to be the community organizer. My job is to sharpen the legal guillotine." The phrase sent a chill down my spine, but it was a good chill. For the first time, I felt like I had a partner who understood the stakes and had the weapons to win. I left her office feeling 10 feet tall. That evening, I called George Henderson. "George," I said, "it's time to liberate the gnomes." I explained the conversation with the lawyer, the need for a united front. There was a moment of hesitation in his voice. He was a good man, but he wasn't a fighter. "I don't know, Mark. She can be so Vindictive. That's her weapon, George, I countered. Isolation. She picks us off one by one. She makes us feel ashamed and alone. But what happens when we're not alone? What happens when 10, 15 of us show up to the next board meeting, all with the same story, all with legal backing? I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Okay, he said, his voice firmer now. What do you need? That weekend, we held a meeting. Not in my house, which we knew Karen watched like a hawk, but in the back room of the local library booked under George's wife's name for her book club. I was expecting 5 or 6 people. 17 showed up. There was the young couple, the Diazes, who had been forced to repaint their daughter's lavender-painted swing set, a more natural wood tone. There was Mrs. Gable, a widow in her 70s, who had been fined because the small memorial garden she planted for her late husband contained an unapproved variety of rose. There was a doctor who was being threatened with fines because his on-call schedule sometimes meant he had to park his second car on the street overnight. The stories poured out, a torrent of petty grievances that, taken together, painted a portrait of a community under siege. Each story was the same: a vague violation, a massive fine appearing out of nowhere, and a complete refusal by the board to engage in any meaningful dialogue. They were scared, angry, and exhausted. I stood up and laid out the plan. I explained my own situation with the trees. I told them about the research I'd done, the financial records, the pattern of targeting the vulnerable. Then I told them about Jessica and the strategy. We are going to fight back, I said, my voice ringing with a confidence I now truly felt. But we are going to do it her way. We're going to use the rules, the paperwork, the process. We are going to document every single thing. We're going to build a case so airtight and so overwhelming that when we present it, she will have nowhere to run. I passed out packets that Jessica had prepared. They contained templates for affidavits, instructions on how to formally request records from the HOA, and a summary of their rights under state law. Go home, I told them. Write down your stories. Get your documents together. Don't talk to her. Don't answer her calls. From now on, everything goes through me and eventually through our lawyer. The mood in the room had shifted from despair to determination. They weren't just 17 individuals anymore. They were a coalition. The Whispering Winds Homeowners for Fairness was born. As the meeting broke up, George Henderson pulled me aside. He was holding a small, familiar-looking object. It was Norman the gnome. I think you should hold on to this, he said, a twinkle in his eye. He's our mascot. I took the gnome. It felt surprisingly heavy, like a small ceramic brick. It was a ridiculous, absurd, and somehow perfect symbol of our fight. The week leading up to David Chen's inspection was a strange mixture of covert operations and suburban mundanity. On the surface, I mowed my lawn, took out the trash, and waved politely if I saw Karen making her rounds in the golf cart. She'd always give me a tight, smug little smile, the look of a predator who thinks the trap is about to spring. She had no idea I was the one setting it. Beneath the surface, our coalition was a hive of activity. Emails flew back and forth. I became the central repository for a growing mountain of evidence. The Diazes sent me photos of their daughter crying next to her half-painted swing set. Mrs. Gable sent me a heartbreakingly beautiful letter she had written to the board about her husband's love for his crimson glory roses, a letter that had gone completely unanswered. The doctor provided parking garage receipts proving he was at the hospital on the nights his car was ticketed. Each story, each piece of paper, was another thread in the tapestry of Karen's abuse. I organized it all, cross-referencing dates and violation codes, building a database of her tyranny. Jessica was delighted. "This is better than Discovery," she'd cackled over the phone. "They're doing our work for us." My primary mission, however, was preparing for David's visit. I wanted to leave nothing to chance. I went back over my original planting records. I printed out the USDA technical bulletins on windbreak design that I had used as a guide. I even took soil samples from around the trees to have them ready for him, just in case. I was treating this not as a simple visit, but as a formal audit, and I would be prepared. On the day of the inspection, a modest county-owned sedan pulled up to my curb. David Chen was younger than I expected, with a wiry frame and an infectious enthusiasm. He practically bounded out of the car, carrying a tablet and a variety of strange-looking instruments. "Mr. Turner, it's a pleasure," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "I've been looking forward to this. It's not every day I get to see a textbook example of agroforestry in a subdivision." We spent the next 2 hours walking the tree line. He was meticulous. He measured the distance between the rows, identified every single species, and even used a handheld anemometer to measure the wind speed on both the windward and leeward sides of the trees. "Incredible," he muttered, looking at the readings. "You've got a 60, maybe 70% reduction in wind velocity. That's commercial grade. That's what we aim for with 6-row belts on the open prairie." He took photos, made notes on his tablet, and asked me detailed questions about my planting and maintenance routines. It felt less like an inspection and more like a collaboration with a fellow professional. "You know," he said, looking from my trees to the neighboring houses, "you've created a microclimate here. See how the snow melts faster on this side of the street in the winter? How the gardens on this end of the block are more productive? That's not an accident. That's the result of reduced wind stress and moderated temperatures. You've fundamentally improved the ecological function of this area." Finally, he stood back, arms crossed, and just admired the trees. "It's perfect, Mark. It's a model of what we're trying to promote. Environmentally beneficial, aesthetically pleasing, and functionally critical. I'll have the official report and certification to you by the end of the week." The relief was immense, a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now," he said, his expression hardening slightly, "my report gets filed with the State Department of Agriculture and the County Planning Office. It officially designates this vegetative barrier as a protected conservation feature. Any action to remove or significantly alter it without a state permit would be a Class C misdemeanor, subject to fines of up to $5,000 per tree." He paused for dramatic effect. "And I can assure you, no such permit will ever be issued." He handed me his card. "If your HOA has any questions, you have them call me directly. I'll be more than happy to explain the law to them." As he drove away, I saw a curtain twitch in Karen's window across the street. She had been watching. Let her watch, I thought. Let her wonder what a man from the state government was doing in my yard with scientific instruments. Let her anxiety build. Jessica's strategy was to let Karen make the next move, and we wouldn't have to wait long. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived. It was from the HOA's law firm. It was a formal notice of intent to lien, stating that my property was encumbered by a debt of $12,300 in unpaid fines and fees, and that if it was not paid within 15 days, they would place a lien on my house and begin foreclosure proceedings. They had taken the bait. Jessica was ecstatic when I forwarded her the letter. "They did it! They actually did it!" she exclaimed over the phone. "They've just handed us the rope. By sending this without following the proper dispute resolution process outlined in their own bylaws, they've opened themselves up to a massive lawsuit for wrongful lien in violation of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act." The trap was now fully set. We had the certification from the state, which nullified the entire basis of the fines. We had the coalition of wronged homeowners with their sworn affidavits. And now we had a formal, legally actionable threat from their own lawyers that was based on a foundation of lies and procedural violations. We had them on the facts, we had them on the law, and we had them on the process. The only thing left to do was to choose the time and place for the ambush. The annual HOA members meeting was in 3 weeks. The agenda had just been posted. Under old business, there was one item: discussion and vote on enforcement action for property at 1220 Willow Creek Lane, my address. It was meant to be a public shaming, a final, triumphant execution of a disobedient homeowner to remind everyone else who was in charge. Karen was planning to use me as an example. She had no idea we were planning the same thing for her. Jessica's final instructions were simple. Don't respond to the lawyer's letter. Don't say a word to anyone on the board. Pay your regular HOA dues on time to show you're a member in good standing. And then we go to the meeting and we watch her self-destruct. The night of the annual meeting, the air in the community center's multi-purpose room was thick with a nervous energy. The place was usually half empty for these things, attended only by Karen, her two bored cronies, and a few lonely retirees. Tonight, it was standing room only. Our coalition had turned out in force. The Diazes were there. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Evans, the quiet widow Mrs. Gable, and at least 20 other families who had been touched by Karen's reign. We had coordinated our arrival, trickling in small groups so as not to raise suspicion, and had spread ourselves throughout the room. We looked like a random assortment of concerned homeowners, not a disciplined army about to launch a coup. I found a seat in the back with Sarah. Jessica was a few rows ahead, looking like just another resident in a simple pantsuit, her briefcase on the floor next to her. She caught my eye and gave me a barely perceptible nod. Everything was in place. At the front of the room, Karen sat at a long folding table, flanked by Stan and Brenda. She was in her element, beaming under the fluorescent lights, a queen presiding over her court. She was wearing a garish, sequined jacket that glittered every time she moved. She clearly saw the large crowd as a validation of her own importance, not as a sign of impending doom. She banged a small gavel on the table. "Welcome, everyone, to the annual meeting of the Whispering Winds Homeowners Association." She boomed into the microphone, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. The first hour was a painful exercise in bureaucratic theater. Karen droned on about her accomplishments over the past year. The successful implementation of a new holiday decoration policy, no inflatables, the standardization of mailbox finishes, and the robust health of the HOA's finances. She presented a slideshow with pictures of violation properties before and after remediation. A freshly sodded lawn, a repainted fence, a driveway scrubbed clean. It was propaganda, pure and simple. When she got to the budget, she proudly pointed to the line item for compliance revenue. "As you can see," she said, tapping the screen with a laser pointer, "our diligent enforcement of community standards has led to a significant increase in non-dues revenue, which has allowed us to undertake several new beautification projects without raising your quarterly fees." She was openly bragging about the shakedown. A low murmur went through the crowd. I could feel the anger in the room building, a low-pressure system gathering strength. Finally, she arrived at the last item on the agenda. "And now," she said, her voice dropping into a somber, serious tone, "we come to a difficult matter under old business. The ongoing willful non-compliance of the property at 1220 Willow Creek Lane." Every eye in the room turned to me. I remained perfectly still, my face a neutral mask. "As you know," Karen continued, oozing false sympathy, "the board has tried for months to work with Mr. Turner to resolve this issue. His unapproved and overgrown tree line is a significant violation of our community's aesthetic standards. Despite numerous notifications, he has refused to comply." She clicked to a new slide. It was a photo of my house with the windbreak circled in a dramatic red marker. "The fines have now reached," she paused, consulting her notes for dramatic effect, "a total of $22,500. The board has voted unanimously to place a lien on the property and, if necessary, to initiate foreclosure to protect the property values of our community." A collective gasp went through the room. This was it, the public execution. This was her ultimate power move, demonstrating that she held the financial life and death of every homeowner in her hands. She looked directly at me, a triumphant smirk on her face. "Does the homeowner have anything to say before the board entertains a motion to proceed with legal action?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. This was the moment. I stood up slowly. The room was dead silent. "Yes, Madam President," I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying easily to the front of the room. "I do have a few things to say." I walked to the aisle and began to move toward the single microphone set up for resident comments. All the planning, all the research, all the anger and frustration of the past few months had come down to this single solitary walk. I could feel Karen's smug gaze on my back, could feel the nervous energy of my friends and neighbors. But all I felt was a cold, hard clarity. The engineer in me had identified the structural flaws in her corrupt system. Now the soldier in me was about to exploit them. I reached the microphone, adjusted it to my height, and took a deep breath. The show was about to begin. I tapped the microphone lightly. The sound echoed through the silent room. Madam President, members of the board, fellow homeowners, I began, my voice steady. I did not look at Karen. I made eye contact with the people in the crowd, with George, with the Diazes, with Mrs. Gable. Karen, Madam President, has just told you a story. It's a good story. It has a villain, me, and a hero, her, saving the community from my terrible trees. But it's just that, a story. I'd like to present you with a few facts. From my jacket pocket, I pulled a small USB drive. First, let's talk about these unapproved trees. I walked over to the laptop controlling the projector, unplugged Karen's laser pointer dongle, and inserted my own drive. A few clicks, and the image of my house was replaced by a scanned document. My original landscaping plan from 5 years ago, with a large approved stamp from the Developer-Controlled Architectural Review Committee. This is the plan I submitted and had approved before planting a single tree, I explained. The unapproved trees were, in fact, fully approved from the very beginning. Karen started to splutter from her seat. That was the old board. That doesn't count. According to the bylaws, I said without looking at her, approvals from the ARC are permanent and transfer with the property unless the plan is materially altered. It has not been. Click. The next image appeared on the screen. It was a stunning high-resolution aerial photograph of the western edge of our subdivision, showing my tree line and the houses behind it. Superimposed on the image were colored arrows showing wind patterns. Now let's talk about aesthetic standards. These trees are not a decoration. They are a functional windbreak, designed and planted according to United States Department of Agriculture, best practices for soil and wind erosion control. I could see David Chen in my mind's eye, nodding in approval. Click. The next document filled the screen. It was the official report from the State Agricultural Extension Service, complete with the state seal at the top. I used my cursor to highlight the key phrases as I read them aloud. Functionally critical, environmentally significant, 60 to 70% reduction in wind velocity. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the most important part. I highlighted the final paragraph. Pursuant to State Statute 4.17-B, this vegetative barrier is hereby designated a protected conservation feature. Any attempt to remove or alter this feature without a permit from the State Department of Agriculture is a violation of state law. The silence in the room was now absolute, heavy, and stunned. I could feel the collective shift in understanding. This wasn't about a homeowner breaking the rules. This was about an HOA president trying to force a homeowner to break the law. So, Madam President, I said, finally turning to face her. Her face, which had been a triumphant pink, was now a pasty, mottled white. The sequins on her jacket seemed to mock her. Your demand that I remove these trees is not just a violation of our bylaws. It is a demand that I commit a criminal act. The $22,000 in fines you have levied against me are based on this illegal demand and are therefore null and void. I let that sink in for a moment. Then I turned back to the audience. But this isn't just about my trees. It's about a pattern of abuse. And that was the cue. Jessica Riley stood up from her seat in the third row. Point of order, Madam President, she said, her voice sharp and clear as a bell. Karen, looking completely bewildered, just stared at her. Who are you? Jessica Riley. I'm an attorney representing Mr. Turner, she said, walking calmly to the microphone as I stepped aside. And I am here to inform the board that your actions constitute wrongful lien, breach of fiduciary duty, and a violation of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. But more importantly, I'm here as a resident. I live on Ash Street. It was a brilliant move, establishing herself as one of them before revealing herself as a lawyer. And I've heard some things. I've heard that this board, under President Karen's leadership, has been issuing fines without proper notice, without board hearings, and without any basis in the written covenants. One by one, as planned, our coalition members stood up. George Henderson was first. She fined me $50 a day for a garden gnome my grandchildren gave me, he said, his voice trembling with righteous anger. Maria Diaz stood up, tears in her eyes. She made us repaint our daughter's swing set because the color wasn't harmonious? Dr. Evans stood up. She tried to fine me for parking on the street when I was on call at the hospital saving someone's life. The stories came faster and faster, a tidal wave of resentment and frustration breaking over the board table. Mrs. Gable, small and frail, stood up, clutching a photo. She called my late husband's memorial roses an unapproved variety. These roses won prizes. A local news reporter, whom Jessica had quietly tipped off, was now in the back of the room, camera rolling, capturing every moment of Karen's public disintegration. She tried to regain control, banging her gavel weakly. "This is out of order. This is not on the agenda." "Oh, I think it is," Jessica said, her voice like ice. She gestured to the crowd. "This is the agenda. You are required by law and by your own bylaws to act in the best interest of the entire community, not to use your position to bully residents and fund your beautification projects with illegally obtained fines." She turned to Stan and Brenda, who looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. "And as for the rest of the board, your unanimous votes make you just as liable. You had a duty to question, a duty to oversee. You failed." Karen stood up, her face contorted in a mask of pure fury. "This meeting is adjourned," she shrieked. "No!" George Henderson's voice boomed from the back. "It's not." He walked to the front, holding a clipboard. "According to Article 3, Section 4 of the bylaws, a special vote can be called by a petition of 25% of the homeowners. I have here the signatures of 40% of the homeowners in Whispering Winds, calling for an immediate vote of no confidence in the removal of the entire board of directors." He slapped the clipboard down on the table in front of her. It was over. She stared at the pages of signatures, the names of her friends and neighbors, a testament to her failure. The queen had been deposed. The castle was falling. The vote was a mere formality, a public execution of Karen's reign. George Henderson, showing a surprising aptitude for parliamentary procedure, took control of the meeting. He called for a show of hands. All those in favor of removing Karen, Stan, and Brenda from the HOA Board of Directors, effective immediately, for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty, please raise your hand. A forest of hands shot up. Mine, Sarah's, the Diaz's, Mrs. Gable's, Dr. Evans, and dozens more. It was nearly unanimous. "All opposed?" George asked. 3 hands remained down, Karen's, Stan's, and Brenda's. Karen stared at her hands in her lap, refusing to acknowledge the humiliation. Stan looked at the floor. Brenda was openly weeping. "The motion carries," George announced, his voice resonating with a quiet authority he never knew he possessed. "The board is hereby dissolved." A wave of applause and cheers swept through the room, a release of years of pent-up frustration. It wasn't loud or triumphant, but rather relieved, like the collective sigh of a community that could finally breathe again. The next hour was a whirlwind of constructive democracy. George, bless his heart, was nominated to be the interim president, a role he accepted with a reluctant sigh. "Until we can sort this mess out." A new temporary board was elected, made up of people who had been victims of Karen's tyranny. Maria Diaz, who promised to form a new, reasonable ARC, Dr. Evans, who volunteered to be treasurer and conduct a full, transparent audit of the last 2 years of finances, and 2 other sensible, level-headed homeowners. The first official act of the new board was a motion, proposed by Maria Diaz, to immediately void every single outstanding fine issued under Karen's presidency. The second was to fire the HOA's law firm. The third, and my personal favorite, was a motion to formally recognize my Windbreak as a valued community asset, and to send a letter of commendation to the State Agricultural Extension for their guidance. As the meeting finally broke up, people came up to me, shaking my hand, patting me on the back. Mrs. Gable gave me a hug, pressing a perfect, fragrant red rose into my hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "You gave us our neighborhood back." But the night wasn't over. As Sarah and I were walking to our car, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Karen. The sequin jacket was gone. Her makeup was streaked with tears, and her face was a wreck of collapsed arrogance. "You," she spat, her voice a venomous hiss. "You think you're so smart. You ruined everything." "No, Karen," I said, my voice devoid of anger, only a vast, weary pity. "You did. You had a little bit of power and you used it to hurt people. You could have built a community. Instead, you built a fiefdom. This was inevitable." She looked at me, her eyes searching for a crack in my calm, for any sign of the fear she was so used to inspiring. She found none. She let out a frustrated scream, a raw animal sound of pure rage, and stomped off to her car, alone. The next morning, Jessica filed the lawsuit. It wasn't against the HOA. We were the HOA now. It was a civil suit filed against Karen, Stan, and Brenda personally. It didn't ask for millions, which would have been thrown out as frivolous. It asked for a very specific, carefully calculated amount, the exact sum of money required to repay every illegal fine they had levied, plus Jessica's legal fees, and a small amount for punitive damages. It was designed not to make anyone rich, but to make the victims whole and to ensure that the three of them were held personally, financially accountable for their actions. It also sent a powerful message to any future HOA board. You are not untouchable. With her reputation in tatters and facing a lawsuit she couldn't afford, Karen put her house on the market a week later. It sold in a month. I watched the moving truck come and go, feeling not triumph, but a quiet sense of closure. The infection had been removed. The healing could begin. The months that followed were a quiet revolution. The new board, led by George, methodically dismantled Karen's oppressive regime. The pages of arbitrary rules were pared down to a few common-sense guidelines. The ARC, now chaired by Maria Diaz, approved a vibrant new palette of house colors and celebrated creative landscaping. The community Facebook page, once a source of bitter arguments, was now filled with pictures of neighborhood potlucks, kids playing on the newly re-lavendered swing set, and Mrs. Gable's prize-winning roses. The audit conducted by Dr. Evans revealed the full extent of Karen's financial mismanagement. The beautification funds had been spent on frivolous projects, like installing expensive, uncomfortable stone benches that no one ever used, and paying exorbitant fees to a landscaping company owned by Karen's cousin. The findings were presented at the next community meeting, not for retribution, but for transparency. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court. Karen, Stan, and Brenda, on the advice of their lawyers, agreed to pay the full amount. The money was placed into a restitution fund, and checks were cut to every homeowner who had been illegally fined. I received a check for the full amount of Jessica's retainer, which I promptly signed over to her. George Henderson received a check for the exact value of his gnome-related fines, which he ceremoniously used to buy a new, even more whimsical collection for his garden, now proudly displayed on his front lawn. One evening, about a year later, I was out in my backyard, checking the growth of the trees. They were taller now, thicker, a formidable living wall. The wind was blowing hard from the west, a real prairie gale. But behind the tree line, in my yard, the air was still and calm. The sound of the wind was a distant roar, a monster held at bay. Sarah came out with 2 glasses of iced tea. We stood there for a moment, just listening to the quiet. You know, she said, it's not a windbreak anymore. No? I asked, taking a sip of tea. What is it? She smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. It's a monument to not backing down. I looked at the dark green line of cedar and oak, standing resolute against the wind and the sky. She was right. It was more than just trees. It was a symbol of what a community could be when people stood together against petty tyranny. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most deeply rooted things are not trees, but principles. And for that, it was a fight worth having. The wind howled on the other side, but here in the sanctuary we had fought for and won. Everything was peaceful. And Norman the gnome, who now sat on my own back patio as our guest of honor, seemed to agree.